Okay. Yes, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this Ask the Analyst session for the 2024 9 Grid for Digital Learning. I'm John Kennard, Content Editor at Fosway Group, Europe's #1 HR industry analyst, and I'll be your host for today's session. Now, founded in 1996, Fosway Group provides in-depth corporate research on next-gen HR talent and learning practices. We provide analyst and advisory services to more than 3,000 European and international headquartered multinationals and corporates, as well as independent vendor research and EMEA market commentary. Now, before we launch into the body of the session, let me also take this moment to tell you about Fosway Corporate Membership. This is one of our newest services. The FCM is an invite-only network for HR learning and talent leaders, offering privileged access to the data and insights that sit behind the 9Grid and realities research. Also, automatic booking privileges for our roundtable program and the opportunity to book exclusive time with a member of our analyst team too. There's plenty more besides this, so do contact us afterwards if you're interested in learning more. Now, I'm delighted to welcome lead analyst on this research, Myles Runham, as well as Fosway CEO and co-founder and founder David Wilson, to dissect and discuss all the findings in this latest iteration of the Digital Learning 9Grid. A couple of housekeeping notes before we get started. We'll have a lengthy Q&A session at the end, but please feel free to ask questions as we go along, and I'll either ask them there and then if it works in the flow, or save them up till the end of the Q&A section. Please play nicely, of course, and do lean into this discussion. Before we get into the main body and talk about the Digital Learning 9Grid, over to you, David, for a bit of scene setting about the exhaustive research that goes behind each one of these 9Grids.
Hello, everybody, and good afternoon from me too, from rather drizzly Cotswolds. We always try and start these sessions with just a few minutes to cover off a couple of slides to talk about the 9Grid. Obviously, thank you for coming today and for showing your interest. I think it's always useful to have a bit of context. Even if you've heard this before, I mean, I think it's still worth re-emphasizing. So the research process behind the 9Grid is pretty extensive. It's a bit of a monolithic effort, to be honest, each year, and we do rebuild it each year. So actually, when we're looking at what we consider market average in terms of functionality, when we're talking about vendor momentum and so on, it is always re-updated each year, and all the perspectives are. We get a lot of input, obviously, from our corporate research network. John mentioned the new membership options as well, about what's going on. Really, what we're trying to understand really from the market is who's doing what with who, what they think of them, and how successful that's being. We get a lot of also corporate inquiries, so we do specific work around that, obviously providing specific private input to organizations. We run a lot of public research as well, as you know, in terms of things like the realities research and so on. And then we run a whole very extensive vendor process where we do structured data capture with them, looking at functional and non-functional capabilities. We also do vendor briefings. We do customer referencing calls, and so each one of these is a monster. Each one seems to get bigger as well, both in terms of the scope. Whilst we'll talk obviously about the 9Grid and the vendors that are on it, we also track an awful lot of vendors that aren't on it as well. So it gives us a really comprehensive view of what's actually going on in the market. I think the key thing to understand is who these are written for. So our primary audience, as John said earlier, is typically a European or EMEA headquartered multinational, private sector company, some of the big global biggest global companies downwards. And what we're really looking at is what we think the main buying options are that are relevant to them, and also the view of them from of those vendors from those companies. So in terms of who gets included, it's the main vendor options that are in active use within those research network companies. Who are they already using? Who are they considering using? And also, to some degree, we're also looking for innovator companies that we believe have the potential to become part of that. There is no vendors can't buy their way onto the 9Grid. They can't buy their way off it or decline to be included as well. It's purely based on our decision, based on the relevance for that target audience. There's no pay for play involved at all. In terms of I described a very extensive set of input behind it. I think the key thing for you to understand as well is that really the most important view is what customers say about the vendors, not what the vendors say about themselves. The vendor input is really helpful, it's really useful, but it is what we use to cross-validate, look for areas and things, maybe things we didn't know about them, rather than necessarily determining their final position. It's not a rating process that's driven purely by scoring out of a spreadsheet, for example. And just in summary, obviously we have huge amounts of customer and data in set hard data. We have tens and tens of thousands of line items of functional things we're all analyzing, and we're trying to really from that distill and have the best view of the market, as I said, aimed at that primary readership. The final point I'll make, which is, again, I make all the time, is everybody sees the 9-grid diagram, but then you would strongly recommend you actually read the report that goes alongside it. It's free to access. You just have to register and access through a website. It has a fairly extensive look at some of the market trends involved, some of which we'll talk about today. And as well as obviously looking at the ratings of the vendors themselves in a slightly more, in other forms. It also explains how the 9-grid is constructed, what the different criteria mean, and how that applies in this case to digital learning. So definitely worth reading. We get a lot of organizations that read those and actually reference some of those trends out of it as well. But it's also very helpful in understanding how we're looking at the vendors and how we're rating them as well. So Myles, over to you.
Thanks, David, and thanks everybody for joining us. As I think Jack's just put in the chat, share your questions and thoughts as we go through. We'll pick up everything we can. So just picking up from David's point. So in terms of digital learning provision, there are 5 principal areas that we look at. It's not a hard and fast definition, but these are the core components that we look to in defining what a digital learning provider is. So that's obviously about the learning experience. Content comes into that. Content not the only component, so that's sort of a full definition, a rich definition of learning experience. Platform provision, that can be learning systems provision, but frequently in the digital learning grid, it's the solution platform. So there's a sort of specialist component to that, depending on the type of service or suite or specialist that we're covering. Consulting is a significant component, and we'll come to this shortly. Actually, consulting and advisory services are becoming more important in the market as it matures and evolves. Service provision has been an area of significant importance for a long time. That might be sort of managed service and outsourcing, but also other areas of service and service management for customers, principally perhaps for larger, more complex organizations, but not only those. And lastly, it's worth referencing thought leadership as well. That's a really significant component of the market, is sort of helping, I suppose, to raise the tide of understanding and knowledge in the segment, in the sector as well. And that might be sharing research, conducting research, etc., and activity in the customer community. All of these then point to this ability to be a transformative digital learning partner. So that's the market sort of seeking maturity, I guess. And it's not just about provision for consumption. This is about transformation through digital learning partnership. That's sort of the goal for many of the providers and the customers. Just a quick note on the suites and specialists. So suite providers, unsurprisingly, cover a range of those service components. So that might be bespoke digital learning content, also off-the-shelf library services, blended learning enablement provision, and broader definitions of learning experience, coaching, digital adoption, etc. So there's a sort of a range under those suites. The specialist providers tend to focus on a specific area of capability. Unsurprisingly, in this iteration of the research, excuse me, we've tended to focus there on ongoing focus on off-the-shelf content library provision, digital adoption, which is becoming a much more significant component of the market, and then various sort of elements of immersive learning experiences, which can be simulation, scenario-based learning, games, etc., are probably the most significant of the specialist areas that we've covered in the report. I just want to talk As a few observations. This is lifting out some of the themes from the report itself behind the grid. And then obviously in the questions we can get into more detail. Probably the most significant in reviewing the findings throughout the analysis phase, the most significant message really is that the economy's been tough. So on the customer side, we've seen a number of sort of flatlined or reduced budgets. And also not just it's important to recognize it's not just about budgets being flat or reduced or increasing slowly. There's also been some more pressure on the buying cycle, so that's more cause for justification for budgets, maybe budget decisions going higher up the chain for approval. One of the interesting things which has played into the market as well is seeking, I guess, greater signals of value for investment, particularly for bespoke or custom projects. Well, releasing budgets for sort of known challenges and demonstrable and quantified challenges, and then the requirement to monitor the progress of those as well. So that's played on the market, and then from a vendor's perspective, obviously that's made for much more challenging trading conditions. So there's been a little bit of a shift in terms of performance. Something of a shift to the left-hand side, really, as that's impacted the market in terms of ability to grow commercially, so grow customer numbers and growing revenues. Unsurprisingly, AI was the big story in so many of the briefing conversations, and particularly focusing on recent and upcoming roadmap developments on the vendor side. So a lot of investment in artificial intelligence, mainly focused on the production and creation of content, I guess, sort of course authoring. That's been the main focus, not the only focus, but that's a big area. So that's some significant efficiency and cost savings being realized there, which will play out, I guess, over the next 12 months and beyond. I think in terms of customer expectations, probably there's a lot of interest, a lot of expectation in artificial intelligence on the buyer side. Less experience of application, probably quite a lot of optimism as well, though, actually, sort of interest and curiosity about what can be achieved using these tools and technologies, not least of which is the skills story. And the skills story sort of was setting the agenda last year and the year before and continue to do this year. So really this is sort of the strategic agenda for the learning function on the customer side. So this is about the validation and identification of skills gaps, and the ability to analyze and prioritize those gaps into sort of planning of development, then into sort of managing the content and the experiences to develop skills, and then monitor and manage that skills growth and development as well. So this really plays out across the whole of the learning cycle. The market's becoming more complex, which is probably what we might expect. I think there's some interesting new entrants, which we might come back to. I think one of the interesting things about the complexity is the number and variety of relationships now on the vendor side. So this is channel partnerships to reach customers. It's more strategic partnerships to maybe band together and sort of fuel each other's solutions, etc. as well. So I think that the sort of competitive intensity grows, but also does the complexity for customers to sort of read through the market as well, and to decode and detect what's happening and who's most valuable for on the customer side as well. And not least of which is this sort of competition for strategic partner status. So this tends to be for larger and more complex customers who are looking for a more sort of mature and extensive relationship. But on the supplier side, on the supply side, I think a lot of providers are looking to strike those more strategic, longer term relationships, in the recognition that sort of content and systems, to put it very crudely, are only part of the solution. Competition is intensifying. So how to find, strike, and then manage longer term strategic relationships is a really important competitive dynamic for a number of providers, whether specialist or the suites. I think it probably plays out slightly differently in each, and that that's ongoing. I think probably the further up and towards the right you get on the grid itself, you'll see that strategic partnership sort of competition play out a little more intensely. I guess those are the most important dynamics. I don't want to go into too much detail before the questions. David, is there anything you'd want to add or reflect on in addition to those points before we get into the Q&A?
No, I think your point at the end there about the partnerships is really important, but it's sort of something that everybody talks about, but sometimes the reality is often the reality of the experience is often quite different in terms of the behavior, actually both from the buyer and sometimes from the supplier around it. I think the reality is that the higher you go up the grid, the larger and more complex the customer organization tends to become, and therefore often the scale of those organizations, these are the bigger suppliers maybe, but they're also, and tend to be more global actually in many cases. But it's also the ability to serve a multiplicity of needs within a relationship rather than and to be able to execute well in different geographies as well becomes also a more critical factor as well, I think. The other comment I was going to make, which is more just from a background perspective, is in many ways the digital learning 9-grid is the most schizophrenic of all of the 9-grids in some ways, because it does encompass content companies, service companies, and hybrid companies, including things like managed services and so on. And it has evolved quite a lot over the time from originally looking at things like custom e-learning and into then wider content and then into custom solutions and so on and things like this. So inherently there is a bigger mix in terms of the types of organizations here. Some of these are very geographically located, others are more strategic, etc. as well in terms of their presence, and more types, in terms of their and at the moment we've talked about a couple of main specialisms, but I mean in reality there are obviously potentially lots and lots of different specialisms we could build out over time, but it's all already very crowded and quite nuanced. And the only other final comment I was going to make is obviously we're off the back of being at Learning Technologies in London last week, and personally I met with a lot of the CEOs of some of these companies as well as obviously customer organizations. And I think your point about the kind of economic climate and the budgets, pretty much universally all the vendors talked about the market being a lot harder, off the sugar rush maybe of the pandemic period and into this situation where obviously there's pressure around budgets, but also decisions are harder to come by and so on. So I think that is worth re-emphasizing even more, because there's definitely been a downshift in a lot of the vendor growth because of it.
Yeah, I think it's a good point. Can't overemphasize that point. I think it's interesting seeing the well, mentioned briefly that sort of efficiency opportunity from AI as well, in terms of the time and cost of bringing content to market. I know content can mean a number of things, but if that were happening at a time of plenty, the dynamics might be different. But it's happening at a time of economic hardship, which I think is going to be an interesting interesting part of the story over the next sort of 12 to 18 months, perhaps.
And we talked about this as part of obviously the analysis and the report cycle, is the fact that that's already starting to impact the buyer mentality a little bit, and putting pressure. Obviously, vendors are looking at the use of AI to accelerate production, and I know we were quite interested in looking at things like synthetic media and other things as well, right? So the potential to be really disruptive around the production cycle, but it was also quite clear that corporates were also looking at it as a way of negotiating price down as well.
Yeah, I think it's right. It's interesting that these generative AI tools, only one strand of the AI world, I guess, but they're as available to the customers as they are to providers, and it's reasonably transparent how extensive those savings could be, I think.
Yeah. So, John, over to you. Do you want to do some questions?
Sure. So we got a really good mix of questions, some of which are kind of specific about this grid and some of them about the process in general. So I might take a generalized one first, actually, from Lorenzo, who's asked, how is the potential of a vendor assessed? We sort of covered it a little bit at the beginning, but David, if you wanted to talk about that first, before Myles, maybe you can go into the specifics of this grid. The potential of a vendor, what are the elements?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, and again, this is a really good example where read the report, because it actually tells you a bit more about what the criteria are behind it. Potential is really an assessment of the capability of a vendor to deliver the value that they can deliver against the increasingly larger type of organization as we got the 9-grid. So we talk a lot around the scope and sophistication of what they offer and the ability to serve more demanding, if you like, needs, etc. Now, the way in which potential manifests itself is different if you're a suite provider. In other words, you're trying to provide a broad set of services and capability across everything, where obviously there we're looking really at the totality of what you offer and the ability to do that in scale for larger and more complex customers versus a specialist, which may only do one thing. Okay, so specialists get assessed slightly differently around that because obviously we're looking at how they are with that specialism and typically who their target customer is and who they serve around it very well. One of the things that is worth being aware of is it gets, going up is actually quite hard to do. And then what we find generally across 9-grids is that you can, we sort of effectively end up banding and looking at this because remember, all of the 9-grids, it's not linearly scored. It's actually each of the sub ratings is banded together, and then we end up with this higher, mid, and lower assessment against somebody. It's all against enterprise customers, but at the end of the day, if you're predominantly serving large enterprise customers with a higher level of capability, then you will tend to be viewed as a higher from a potential perspective. So it's quite tricky in some ways to move up because you're often what you're doing is recalibrating the service capability you have to a completely different class of organization at a higher level of complexity and sometimes also geographical execution as well. And this is one of the things we sometimes find with core leaders, in that mid-right, is they often kind of assume that there's a trajectory upwards means they're going to step up into strategic leader, but that's often a 10x jump in terms of capability set to be able to be there. Myles, do you want to add anything specifically around what you're looking for? Obviously, you already shared the 5 different areas of capability that you were looking at earlier. But...
No, I think what's probably this is probably just adding to your point, David, about the sort of slightly schizophrenic nature. I think one of the interesting things about potential ratings in digital learning is it covers elements of technology, it covers elements of design capability and feature set and functionality, but it also, what's really important, particularly important here on the customer side, is some of that sort of service potential as well. And I think that's which was really came through in a lot of the customer referencing and customer conversations. Those elements of service from a digital learning point of view, perhaps stronger than they might be in some of the other grids, which are more focused on sort of feature set and functionality.
Thanks, Myles. Got an interesting question from Francisco actually, and not something I've tended to think about. But do you ever come across the possibility of companies that pair well together? That seems a little specific, but Myles, particularly in this instance of the 9-grid, do you ever look at how some of the analyzed companies work well together, across different aspects?
Yeah, I guess I suppose probably one of the most obvious pairings is sort of the content providers, content library providers with the systems providers, which tends to be a sort of pairing of, on the content provider side, distribution access to customers on the systems side. I suppose that the pairings that I think are most interesting really is that this area of probably there's something quite interesting about the service management as well, and there's something interesting about the dynamics of the industry where that, as David was saying, particularly for the larger, more complex providers, they're looking to kind of simplify their supply environment. So they're looking for fewer relationships to still get the most choice, if you like. So they're trying to sort of wrap in a lot of service provision into smaller, fewer relationships with larger service providers. I think there's some interesting relationships there where some of the specialists sort of trying to access larger customers through those relationships as well as directly now. I don't know if those are necessarily elegant pairings, but they're important ways of getting to the market. I think we're seeing more of that now. But I think probably the most obvious of those pairings is the off-the-shelf providers with the systems providers as sort of channel to market, I think.
I think the other thing is, so all of the 9 grids actually, including the more tech platform orientated ones, one of the things we're looking at is the ecosystem that surrounds a vendor. And that is really, there's 2 aspects to that. One is who is in their ecosystem. In other words, what are the things that they can collectively bring to the table as part of their solution capability with somebody, with a customer. But also the other side of it is whose ecosystem are they part of, right? So that obviously directly impacts, for example, the content companies. If they are limited in terms of the learning systems that they can plug into or whatever, this is obviously a direct correlation. So that whole ability, and there's no doubt that digital learning, and in its widest sense, or learning technology in its widest sense, is very much an ecosystem market. It's not a system market. The other thing is, when we're looking at, I think from a solutions perspective, so if we're looking at learning programs and so on, and looking at the experiences somebody can build, then in many cases, that obviously some of those experiences explicitly require use of technology or programmatic learning that might involve the use of virtual tools alongside content and collaboration and so on, and things like this as well. So it's actually quite a complex landscape that we're actually looking at, I think. But the ability to play well across that does make a material difference, I think, in terms of what somebody's potential is. The more narrow that they are in terms of what they offer and who they plug into, effectively, sometimes the narrower the proposition is. So that can be really, really well suited for a certain customer demographic, but really not not useful outside that. Also, by the way, applies by geography. When you're looking at content partnerships, for example, when you talk about global customers, you also then get pulled into, obviously, things like regional content partnerships and bits and pieces like that sometimes as well.
Thanks, David. A question from Ifaf, a specific line from the report that's been pulled out. Myles, could you expand on this? The economic impact of AI, especially generative AI, on content production is already leading to expectations from some customers of lower prices. Seems logical, but could you expand on that statement at all?
Yes, I suppose, as we touched on a little bit earlier, we've seen for a large number, well, pretty much all of the vendors who are involved in content creation and design and production, which is most, have been either actively or at least exploratively applying generative AI to those design and production workflows. So they're using generative AI tools in the automation of tasks across that production design and production workflow. So that's media asset creation and content authoring into content solutions or into courses. So they're applying generative AI to automate various steps and components of that workflow in different ways, using slightly different tools, but that's generally the story. What we're seeing is that that there are substantial, I mean, it's almost impossible to overestimate the extent that these savings are going to, are being realized. So things that might have taken 5 days are now going to take 1 day. Things that used to take a month are going to take a week, for example. So these are, very, very significant savings of time and effort in being achieved to achieve very similar results, and importantly, results that customers are comfortable with, sort of meeting the relevant quality threshold. So those are really, really significant changes to the economics of design and production. And as we were saying with David earlier, that customers know this. So, the significant savings being made, and there's some, this is initial kind of anecdotal evidence that customers think, well, okay, we know how much quicker and easier it is to run through these steps then. So what does that mean for the prices that we can expect for a similar kind of product? Obviously, if you're creating something that you're then adding value to in different ways, that would be a different conversation. So the point is that, that sort of that economic cat is out of the bag a little bit, and customers are starting to think, what that might mean for their bargaining power in their purchasing decisions. I hope that's clear for IFAF, but to follow up if not.
Seems so. Thanks, Myles. Anything to add, David?
I think the bit that's the biggest unknown is just how big the impact of that will be. I think the reality is, my sense is, and I think we're obviously tracking this very, very extensively in multiple different ways, but the AI has a potential to disrupt learning, possibly as much or more than almost any of the other parts of the HR and talent life cycle. That if we approach it based on, let's just apply AI with the same kind of expectations of outputs and outcomes, then in some ways we've already missed the point, because I think we're in the process of training a large amount of learners that they don't even have to go and do learning. They just go in and ask a question to ChatGPT and get given an answer. And if the answer's not quite right, they ask for a slightly different answer and they get given a slightly different answer. So we're changing almost the dynamic around how people engage with learning as a topic, but at the same time, we're also changing the way in which we assemble the answers we give back to them and the kinds of content that we have. Also, some parts of I think the design and build process that historically were really quite complex around maybe particularly around rich media production and so on and things like this, are potentially the ones that get most accelerated by the AI piece. Now, in all of these things, you have to come back to a very simple question, which is, and we've been around this loop many times in digital learning, which is it effective? How effective is the content? If we end up with a very rapid production for people that then aren't then able to do the job or do whatever they do afterwards, it's not really much use. And in the past, obviously, I think with around a lot of content production, we've got sucked into a conversation around the quality of the output, and often around quite deep conversations around maybe instruction, the instructional design and the experiences being created, when quite tangibly often the experiences from most of the content is quite poor. So I think it's a very interesting sort of to both speculate and to track how this is really going to manifest itself in the market. Definitely the potential for quite significant changes around cost of production is quite high. And as I said, we've already seen anecdotal evidence of that going into the buying process, with people expecting to get a lower price point for what they're looking for, because they know the vendors potentially have access to tools that enable them to accelerate it. And that could still be a win-win, right? Because it could still improve the margins of the producer and at the same time reduce the cost for the consumer as well. So the potential here is quite high, but I think we should be wary of going in it assuming it's a like for like output, because as I said, at the same time, AI is potentially recalibrating the way that learners even approach learning, just like it's recalibrating the way we do search, for example, for stuff on the internet. Okay, so interesting.
Thanks, David. Keep your questions coming in. Lots to get through. I'm going to do them broadly chronologically. The next one is from Andrew Jacobs. Saw your post on LinkedIn a few days ago, and you said you'd come with questions, and you have. So thank you for that. Myles, I hope you're ready. He asks, there were a few themes I saw in both this and the earlier report. One is sustainability. Do Fosway have any plans to include sustainable learning practice in their future assessments? Can you speak to that at all?
Well, I can speak certainly to sustainability. Was an interesting theme in a lot of the as a requirement, I guess, sort of a solution requirement that sustainability feels like it's sort of, perhaps too slowly and perhaps too gradually rising up the agenda of significance as an important sort of topic and skills area. One of the things that's changing, I think, is that it's rising in importance from like a box that has to be ticked in, in your off-the-shelf library, or have we got, do we have enough content on sustainability to actually much more of a significant business priority for customers? So it's more about sort of genuine awareness and the skills to respond to sustainability requirements. So I think we'll see more of that, and I think it will increase. I'm not quite sure that's what you're asking though, Andrew. I think you're probably asking about us scoring vendors in terms of the sustainability of their of them as a provider. And I guess that's something that we might include in the core metrics side of things, providing that it's something that is sort of clearly signaled from the customer side, I guess. I don't know, David, if you want to add anything on sustainability as a kind of vendor scoring criterion. If that's what David if that's what Andrew, rather, beg your pardon, Andrew, was getting at. I think
yeah,
it was.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, by the looks of it. I'm not sure this has been particularly high in the priority of what we've been looking at. I think we've been really more focused on the ability of organizations to really understand and then deliver against the needs of their customers related to the variety of different capabilities and services and products that come into the digital learning space. It's an interesting conversation also around, from a sustainability point of view around the impact of AI, because also I think there are questions around the cost and energy required in order to run AI. But it's something that I think we look at as part of the general business practice rather than necessarily as a specific theme in itself. It's probably the easiest way to answer it.
Thanks both. I think, Myles, I'm going to come on to this one from Matt Ash. You've sort of answered some of it already, but he asks about the Gen AI influence again, pushing down the cost of bespoke and off-the-shelf content. Do you think the recent trend of mergers and acquisitions will continue, increase, or decrease? I think, will we see brands disappear and new startups take their place? I think that's a constant flux, isn't it?
I think, and I suppose in terms of AI, we talked to a number of providers who are probably a bit too small and a bit too early to be included on the grid yet. So I think in terms of new entrants, absolutely yes, and they as you might expect, they're coming sort of thicker and faster, powered by AI or using AI as sort of the most significant component of their solution. So I think we'll continue to see that. In part, that will power some of the M&A activity and acquisition anyway, as startups become available for larger providers to sort of accelerate their own roadmaps. I think we'll continue to see merger and acquisition activity across the digital learning market as well, not just because of the technology component, although that will continue to drive some acquisitions, I think, and partnerships, sort of accelerating technology potential. But I think other drivers that we've seen that we'll probably anticipate to continue to see a kind of market access through acquisitions, either into other territories or buying sort of customer reach and geographic reach in that way. So I think those trends will continue. I think it's what everybody's expecting, and I think if you are a startup and you're an entrepreneur, then your exit moment is part of what will fuel that as well. If you're perhaps a smaller, more entrepreneurial provider. I don't know if, David, is there anything else that with the conversations maybe you had in the last week or so to reflect on?
I'm going to say, one of the interesting evidences of that. So we see this again in everything. The appetite for new players to enter the market, right, continues to be really strong, even in maybe a slightly challenging economic times. And again, walking around the show at Learning Technologies last week was pretty evident for that. There's lots of new companies that are still coming in, either or coming from different geographies sometimes. Sometimes investing quite large in expensive looking stands that are trying to build out. It's pretty hard to find somebody that you're within the room that doesn't say they do skills, doesn't say they do AI, doesn't say they do experience, right? So there's just an utter wall of noise around that. And some of those will, I think, are becoming quite disruptive in the market. And I think inevitably there will be other vendors that become slightly more marginalized or get consumed, or of course become a consumer, because M&A is still quite a big factor around the market as well. So I think it's quite an important thing to always continue to track, which is one of the reasons we have that. We sort of do hunt for the innovators a little bit to understand how the story is evolving and who might be the next big player, right? So some of the vendors we're looking at are very, very large, you know, and therefore unlikely to be threatened very quickly. But as obviously, depending on how fast things shifts, you never quite know how that's going to play out.
Thank you, David. Myles, a question about XAPI and SCORM from Tony Small. Do you see the competition playing out, or how do you see the competition playing out across vendors in the space?
Yeah, it's a good one. I guess you know, always a bit nervous when it comes to standards and learning technology and the extent to which they've pushed the market forward. I think probably that there's more. I think in general there's more interest in XAPI than there used to be, not necessarily because it's a better standard or a better technology, but because it probably better enables the analysis and reporting of sort of value and impact, and the ability to handle broader data sets than just learning technology alone. So I think we've seen some more of that. So I think there's behind alongside that's been more investment in that kind of impact data and analytics as well. I think sort of at the risk of talking about AI all the time, I think one of the things that's been interesting on the vendor side, but not just the vendor side, is the ability of more powerful technologies to absorb a greater data, sort of richness and variety of structured and unstructured data and handle the analysis that way. I think that's probably more likely to advance our capabilities to understand and evaluate sort of value and impact than either XAPI or SCORM in the long term. But I think I've been encouraged to see some more interest in XAPI as well, though. I hope that wasn't sidestepping the question too much.
Anything to add at all, David? Or
no, I mean the standards debate's always been there in the background. I think every so often it asserts itself because there's going to be supposedly an existential shift in what the standard is going to be from AICC originally into SCORM, and then with XAPI, etc. and something. I think, to be honest, I mean, it's really important from a vendor point of view that you are able to deliver solutions that actually work against whatever standard that is needed. I think obviously there are really good reasons why XAPI can create a more diverse set of behavioral data and so on associated with it. But this is something, it's a technical capability that vendors need to do. It's not really generally it doesn't seem to be, other than in niche edge cases, a big differentiator in terms of the capability to win. I think sometimes the capability to deliver is impacted by it or the customer experience afterwards. In other words, does it work, is probably more thing than necessarily whether they're able to win or not around it. I would probably argue, having tracked the market for a long time, that the noise around some of these things was a lot bigger maybe a few years ago than it seems to be now. We seem to have take it for granted maybe a little bit, even though that's probably not completely true, and are focused more on bigger topics like skills, experience, and now AI, I think.
thanks, David. Next question from Marissa, who says, first of all, I found the insights following the report incredibly helpful. Thanks, Marissa. She'd like to understand a bit more about your post talking about the focus on the content and distribution as if it's the only solution, Myles. You mentioned that it's the service that's offered and it's wrapped around the content. It's not always content that even creates that value. Can you expand a bit more on what you meant by that?
Yeah, I guess I suppose this is something. I mean, before I joined Fosway a year ago, so working as a consultant, and then since sort of taking this on, I've been hoping and looking to the market to become more sophisticated and demanding more than just the sort of creation and consumption of content as a solution to a learning or performance problem. And I think it's starting to see some of the signals of that happening now. That having a playlist of content or having a library that ticks off the requirements, making that available, and then encouraging people to to use or consume that content doesn't get anybody far enough, really. And I think what's been interesting to observe with some of the more sort of sophisticated and successful providers who are working with the more demanding and the strategic customers are looking for service providers who will use content where required, but actually are working harder at defining, understanding, and articulating the problem to be solved, then sort of mobilizing around creating the solutions to to those problems, and sort of helping and working with customers to to implement, manage, and optimize that. So I think that's where that the service component comes in. Part of that's in sort of strategic services, in that upfront sort of design thinking, I guess, and analysis. Part of it's in the sort of design service of really clearly articulating the problem, and then quantifying it and being able to sort of define and design the solution. But I think then that last part about sort of optimizing and making the most of the solution is really, really important as well, which takes us sort of beyond the deliver to really to sort of make the solutions work as hard as possible, and into the analysis, reporting and analysis. I guess it's a broader set of services that are required for success than content alone. I think the market in the past has been probably too fixated on not content alone, but too fixated on content and the ability to access and distribute it, really. So that was the point I was trying to get to, I think.
There's something I wrote a long time ago, and I talked about that. I thought that the e-learning market at the time, right, so predating when we started talking about digital learning in a wider sense, but it had been basically hijacked by the content companies, and that we were again really too fixated on content, as if content was always the answer. And I think actually for a lot of the most profound and important learning and development we do, content is sometimes the least important part of the process. And about 20 years ago, maybe nearly 15 plus years ago, I did some work looking at blended learning methodologies and so on. And I think we were focusing then really a lot of companies around modality as well as media. And I think one of the things that, from my point of view, was much more important was how we blended together what I called at the time acquire, practice, and do. So, I think content can be useful for a way of acquiring knowledge. It's not generally very good for practicing how we apply it. And it's certainly not very good for how we actually do work and do things with it. And other elements of this are much more important. And I think this is also very dangerous because I think we've got so myopic around content equals learning, when it quite patently isn't. Then we talk about learning experiences and focusing really around content experiences, as if that was going to suddenly solve that problem as well, right? So I think the danger is this has still continued to be the myth, the content is king myth that's been exhibited almost through the whole period of the market as it's evolved right back to the early 2000s. But in reality, it's it isn't the most important thing. It doesn't deliver the most outcome. And when you focus on outcomes more, then I think it forces you to have to look at that wider capability set that surrounds it. So,
yeah, I think it's a really good point. I think that's really important with the sort of primacy of the skills agenda as well, the ability to practice and apply skills, in as much as a realistic scenario as possible, or in real life, and then get useful and meaningful feedback, from peers, from experts, from managers, from coaches, etc. That sort of practice and rehearse and feedback component is really, really vital as well. And there's a lot more competition around that sort of skills validation and skills analysis as well, which is driving a lot more sophistication, in the solution side, but also from buyer expectations as well.
Exactly. Yeah. So learning is not just about content. It's about a lot more than that. Skills is about a lot more than learning. Right.
Yeah.
Thanks both. So I've got another question from Matt, in fact. Hopefully the answer to this is all of them, or, have you seen any vendors or customers using technology to unlock credible performance impact metrics owned by L&D teams? All of them, Myles, or?
Well, I've seen it, definitely. I think it's become more important, actually. I think it's easy to kind of overlook this. I mean, it's sort of, for as long as I can remember, as long as I've been in the industry, this idea of whether you call it ROI or impact or value has been, so that's what we need to aim for. I think One of the interesting things that's been happening for the last probably 18 months or so, and continue to, I think, probably continue to happening into this year, is the economic impact is playing out on customer needs to demonstrate value, and that's pushing the market. Excuse me. I think that's pushing the market forward. So I don't know whether we would have got there as quickly if the economy had been better. But the economy is sort of almost forcing our hand to become more focused on analysis and reporting. And I think to be fair, on the vendor side, a number of providers have responded to that and have started to, create specific kind of service lines and then the tools around those service lines to support that. And I think we'll see more of that as well. Part of that will be, for on the sort of larger, more sophisticated services where they'll actually have a data and analytics service, and others where it's perhaps more program or custom project based. They'll be required to sort of bundle that the use of that service into that that commission or that purchase. So I think we are seeing more of it. It's not to say that it's a non-rush and everybody's doing it, but I think the economy has is nudging and dragging the market forwards in that respect.
I think there's a lot of focus on showing that that learning has a value and an impact, not necessarily showing the ROI though. I think that potentially is a very relevant conversation in certain circumstances. But it's been that's obviously, I wrote a report on this in 2003. So it's been the perennial challenge almost of the market. And I think obviously learning teams have generally been pretty reluctant to play in that space, but there's some of our realities research, digital learning realities research, that showed that there was an increasing requirement that was to show more, to be able to show more impact from what was being done. And I think that possibly will be accentuated further when there is more technology, open brackets, including AI, that will potentially provide different strategies for delivering against certain skill needs and performance related questions. You've got to justify why you're spending money on learning, right? Building and time. I think that over time that will become more acute, not less. So to some degree, I think we're sort of on a one-way journey, but it doesn't necessarily mean we've got to do an ROI study in order to justify why we do any particular invest in any particular project.
Thank you, David. I think maybe time for one last question. I've got a question about TCO, in fact, total cost of ownership. And as you can see from the top right, obviously there's value in every single zone of the 9 grid. But if you look at the strategic leader position, there are several platforms in there, companies in orange, which is kind of a mid total cost of ownership. So I was wondering, Myles, if you could share how suppliers that don't have a higher TCO have managed to secure strategic leader status, if you can give any insight there.
Yeah, well, I mean, I suppose it's sort of very simply put that not everything that's strategic has to have a premium price associated with it. But I think probably it's more to the point that there's partly it's there's a result of competition there, but I think it's about providers being able to offer, particularly in the strategic leader box, I guess you've got much more capability to offer solutions at scale, which is one of the dynamics that would bring the TCO down. But it also, for those larger providers, they are offering really a sort of very rich and full range of of services that they would make available, not all of which it would make sense to have as as a premium offer. If if wrapped into those is kind of off the shelf content provision, for example, or data analytics services, etc., which are largely technology based, then it would be pretty odd for those to have that kind of premium and premium position and the higher total cost of ownership. So I think it's really about the service mix that's driving that, and also about sort of that sort of range of services that customers are drawing on. I don't know, David, if you want to add anything more about the kind of specifics about the TCO kind of method or anything there. But...
No, I mean, I think the key thing is that, and this is where the slightly schizophrenic nature of the different vendors we're considering also impacts it as well. But I think, the key thing about TCO, it's not just about the buy price, right? It's about the buy, implement, operate, innovate, etc., the whole cycle a little bit. And I think therefore the way in which those services or products are delivered to somebody does impact sometimes the overhead they have around them, how easy it is for them to consume that and get value to deploy things sometimes makes an impact around as well, not just what it costs to produce in the first place. But obviously we're talking about very different things when we're comparing content libraries from custom learning services to manage learning capability or true strategic partnering. The one other comment I'd make, particularly when you're looking at the top right parts of the 9grid, is there are some of the more strategic outsourced companies there, and there is definitely a spectrum of approach. Some of them are trying to be focus on very much a cost arbitrage, sort of let's lower your cost of operation around these things. Others have got more of a premium practice, trying to focus in terms of what they're trying to do. Others have got sometimes a more transformational story, but sometimes the reality can be a little bit more transactional than the customer kind of buys into as well. So there's a sort of range of characteristics that you're looking at from a TCO point of view that ultimately go into a rating. It's also one of the reasons, by the way, that when I was first working on this stuff with David Perring, a long time ago, one of the things we realized was that the actual cost, just like the actual functional skill for a specific customer, obviously was quite context dependent, depending on what their context was, what their needs were, would distort or otherwise how suitable a solution was. And it's one of the reasons we moved towards a banded model rather than a linear score, because effectively, if a vendor is within a zone, a set of vendors are within a zone offering similar capabilities, they're sort of materially equivalent, and to some degree it's down to your specific context and needs as to which ones are strongest for you. It's hard, it's hard from an analysis model to predict that up front, right? You have to that comes down to the detail of the context, and that's just as true is on the platform 9grids like learning systems or cloud HR, that once you're within the context of a zone, the chances are you should probably be looking at all of these and working out which is the right fit for you, because your needs at one point or another may well determine which one of those is the strongest choice or the most expensive choice. It will vary depending on what you want.
Great point to finish on. So that is just about all we've got time for. So it just remains for me to thank Myles and David for their insights on this latest version of the Digital Learning 9grid. Don't forget, you can join corporate membership for inside access to more detailed research, benchmark reports, corporate roundtables, and analyst time as well. Fosway's accelerated buying support to align stakeholders, validate solution strategy, shortlist vendor options, and accelerate and de-risk buying decisions. The QR code on your screen is right there. Thanks to everyone who attended the webinar. This is a few links which could be useful to you. Our 2024 Digital Learning Realities Research, the full report of the 9grid for digital learning, and a page of the other Fosway research as well. There will be an Ask the Analyst coming very soon. Obviously, we've got a lot of activity this year. But for now, thanks very much for your time, and we will see you all very soon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
So, welcome.